Okay, it's a big subject, and I'm only going to touch on aspects of it. So forget Christmas trees, crackers, stockings, all that sort of thing. I have got Christmas tree earrings, but that's the only acknowledgement of that. So I'm a medievalist and an early modernist, so Tudors, that sort of time. And, but I've always been interested in folklore and how religious customs, once you take the religion out of them, the Catholic religious customs become much more like pagan customs. But there will be a nod to Montol and other things as we go along. This slide just shows the Magi arriving at the Nativity in St Neot Church. It's a little bit of the Passion window, an out-of-place piece. But it's lovely that in medieval times, you know, we're used to reading windows like this in comic book style, but they are actually coming towards an earlier event. So the order is a bit reversed. And here we have, I'm sorry about, it's hard to see, but there's a king and a camel. So we may have had the same scene in Bench End at St Column Major. And here we've got the Nativity on a Cornish bench end at Davidstow with the donor below. But baby Jesus is missing, and I think deliberately removed, probably in the Civil War. So Mary and Joseph and the ox. So we are going to be touching on religion as we go through, but first, kind of a theme running through this is how we get from a Catholic custom at a pagan festival time, because the choice of Christmas is very pagan, to charitable giving, to begging, banning and reviving. And I was recently reading Murder in the Mews, and rank excuse for begging, that's what Guy Fawkes Day is, said Japp. An interesting survival, mused Hercule Poirot. And that conversation could certainly have been had about Christmas customs. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to go pretty much chronological. The evidence is fragmentary. If you get references in church wardens' accounts or other things to customs, they rarely tell you what time of year. But my question is, how far did medieval custom inform pre-Victorian traditions and later revivals? So I'm not going to be talking about Victorian Christmas as such, but I'm going to be talking either side of that. And I want you to note that, you know, we are in Advent, or before Christmas is Advent, up till partway through Christmas Eve, and the period of excess after fasting goes on till the Epiphany, so 6th of January, and your decorations could stay up till the 2nd of February. So, you know, all the money we spend on decorations, keep them up. One of the earlier references, and quite a bit of the evidence, is negative evidence. Thou must not do this. And the Glasney College reference from 1360, but clearly talking about the 1350s. And this is a map, coastal map with Glasney with its spire and the coastal defence walls, the chapel of St Mary and St Gluvius Church, the river, Penrhyn River. And this ordinance commented on the silly and harmful pastimes, unbecoming to clerical decency, detestable mockeries of divine worship, disfiguring the vestments and other ornaments of the church with a spattering of low and muddy things. Well, you know, Penrhyn, there's lots of mud. Now, maybe they're referring to the boy bishop, who, having been active on St Nicholas' Day, would also be active in a place like Glasney on Holy Innocents' Day. And that is a sort of world turned upside down, which is absolutely typical of the sort of what one would now refer to as superstitions of medieval Catholicism. But at that time, medieval Catholicism, in my view, was a very broad church indeed. So there is a boy bishop who gets to rule, but he's not actually allowed to take services, though occasionally they did. These are medieval candles, the sort you would have for Christmas, or tapers, and they're big. And when I was looking at Stratton Church, there were references to 4 tapers and £6 of wax for Christmas, and also on one occasion for keeping the tolls wilt, which seems to be the weighing of yarn that took place in the church house opposite. But the point is that, Christmas was still a working time as well. We've talked briefly on boy bishops. We've got gifts given on New Year's Day. And this is still going on at Looney in St Neot parish in 1706 to 7. The new baby has arrived in the Moon household, and the midwife gets a New Year's gift, or the wet nurse, I think it is, which I thought was great. And carols, which will be a recurring theme, actually start as circle dances where you sing and dance, and the carol is almost the dance more than the singing. Merv Davey and Cathy Wallace discovered an early reference, and a rather weird reference, to wassail in Cornwall. And wassail means good health, or any Cornish speakers here? Yeshistar? Yegistar, thank you. And the reference occurs in the Passion play. This is actually the Last Supper. This is a sponge with vinegar crossed with a sword, representing the crucifixion. And at the point where Christ is thirsty, he's offered vinegar. But in the Passion play, a vulgar mixture of bile, wassail if you are thirsty. So the centurion giving the sponge is wishing him good health, but offering him something completely undrinkable. The first real reference where you can start to get an idea of what's going on is the Lanherne household accounts from 1466 to 7. Steward's accounts for Cornwall's leading family. And Mr. Douch transcribed these published in the Journal of the Royal Institution of Cornwall, 1953. I'm going to be showing you the evidence for what I'm saying here, which is that the 12 days included a feast with gilded birds. They had gold foil for the birds, and possibly a peacock, disguising evergreen decorations, a musician and melionic, which Douch and I think might have been a character from a play or a play. He thought it might be the Camborne play, but I think that's possibly a bit tenuous. That was held on New Year's Day. They also had Morris dancers, and they had disguisings made for going to visit Lord Humphrey's Stafford night, which I suspect was somewhere in Cornwall or possibly Devon, because he had a lot of lands here. This is an earlier illustration, probably a century or so earlier, showing animal-headed costumes and a musician there with a guitar. Now, this is what that's based on. So we've got gold foil for the cooks against Christmas, and the term against is used to mean ahead of Christmas. And bird lime for trapping birds. There's green ginger, there's different colours, vermilion, orchidee, which is an ornamental tinsel, plenty of paper, plenty of glue, and gathering ivory boughs, Thomas Hodge and Anthony, 2 white bonnets for the minstrel on New Year's Day, that's a New Year's present, and Holland cloth for Belionic, his costume, bells for the Morris, paper for the Morris, and so on through. And most of this is supplied by Betty. Then we have Thomas Wootton supplies red lead, white lead, glue, verdigris, alum, gold foil and paper. And again, I think we're looking at basically homemade disguisings, but things bought in. Unfortunately, we have the Bodmin Church building accounts from about 4 years later, and it's pretty obvious who Betty is. I think we can identify her almost certainly with Betty Trott, a wealthy Bodmin mercer's widow, and she gives 40 shillings, which is a huge amount of money at a time when a cow would probably cost you about 7 shillings. So we're talking a few £1,000 to the church. And Thomas Wootton lived in the same street, 4 Street in Bodmin, and he was also a mercer. And there's a wonderful court case where Thomas Wootton and another mercer of Bodmin do a citizen's arrest in Plymouth of someone they accuse of piracy on the high seas and taking their trade goods. So we know that a lot of this stuff came from abroad. So that's a wonderful lot of detail that one can put together, albeit about the leading gentry family. Musicians and Morris dancers, well, this is a bonnet with feathers, Tudor bonnet, so a little bit later in date, from about 1539. These are Morris dancers, they've got bells, and so has the fool, he's got bells, and probably bells on the ends here as well. And these are Morris dancers at a midsummer type event in opposite Richmond with a hobby horse and a tabor player rather than a viol player. So you also got Robin Hood, but generally speaking, we're used to these being May the 1st, at Helston, you get Robin Hood and his men, and a version of the Morris dance, May the 8th. But at Lanherne, they are there at Christmas as well. Partly, I think it's more of a good thing, but there are other aspects as to how these characters transfer. And so those are all from Altonan. I've put these in there just to give you an idea of the sort of court entertainments from which the local Arundel ones derive. These are wild men have caught a light at the French court, and one of them has dived into the water butt and manages to save himself, and it was a real event. This is quite a bit later than our period, and it's a courtly mask, but they're all wearing masks, these orange masks, and tinsel and the works, and it's all taking place in a gentleman's house. So they're just to give you kind of a sense of how colourful these things might have been. Well, Edward VI, and you'll know from Wolf Hall he's about to be born and all the rest of it, he was brought up a Calvinist Protestant. We had the most ferocious phase of the Reformation during his reign. But perhaps surprisingly, and he was only a child, of course, he absolutely loved Christmas, and he revived the Lord of Misrule. Henry VIII stopped the Lord of Misrule in about 1535-6 during all his marital troubles, and his son, the arch-Protestant, revives it. And with great expense, £500, not 40 shillings. This is really, we're getting into the big bucks here in 1551-2. They all processed into London. The Lord of Misrule, we know the name of him, he appears out of the moon. There's 2 mock Midsummer Night Festivals, so we're muddling midsummer and midwinter, with hobby horses, a St George banner, more normally associated with 23rd of April or May the 1st, bagpipes, a 12th night joust, and an anti-papist play. And they also have jousts with hobby horses. And the next year, there were Morris dancers and a red and green checkered costume for the Lord of Misrule's fool. And in my view, this sort of thing filtered down to local level. There were people in Cornwall, MPs, who would probably have seen such events, and it's one of the possible reasons why St George plays came to be midwinter and Christmas as well as midsummer. We have a slightly jaundiced view, but you have to put it in context. Item, we will not receive the new service, meaning the prayer book in English, which Edward VI's government introduced, because it is but like a Christmas game. But we will have our old service of matins, mass, evensong, and procession in Latin, as it was before. Well, you can bet if the Christmas games had been banned, they would have protested about that. But what it suggests to me is that a Christmas game or play was rather frivolous compared to a church service. It was also lawless. It was a sort of world turned upside down where anything went, and probably performed in English or Cornish, depending on which part of Cornwall you were in, and certainly not fit for a church. But game is a word used for play as Robin Hood games are usually plays. I'm fascinated by St George. We tend to see St George sitting on his dragon, on his horse, as in this panel, fighting a dragon. But what we don't realise, and we have a very full version of the legend at St Neot Church, he fights the Gauls. He is killed. The Virgin Mary resurrects him from his coffin. And it's a wonderful picture. You can see his face and the shroud and his tomb. And she makes him her knight. And he fights the dragon and rescues the princess, gets called before the king. He has a weight, he's scourged. He is ridden as a horse by the king's son. He's has weights hung from him. He's put into a boiling vat. He's dragged of oil. He's dragged by wild horses. And finally, he's beheaded again. I don't think one would want to be St. George, but the point of all this, he is the ultimate resurrection saint. If you go to St. Neot today, this is now the west window. And it was actually on the south side of the church with the resurrection of Christ immediately above. Medieval artists knew what they were doing. They were getting the message across. Just as Christ was resurrected, so was poor St. George many times. Now, I think we might have a vote on this. Catholic versus Protestant Cornish Christmases. And we know about one from the trial of Sir Francis Tresillian, and we know about the other from the diary of William Carnsue. So they're not the same sources. But if you were a good Catholic at Golden Manor, in Christmas 1575 to 6, starting on Christmas Eve going through to the 6th of January, you would have been entertained by an interlude or play performed by Mr. Twiggs and others. And I got quite fascinated by Mr. Twiggs, who I think probably originated in the Lancen area, because he turns up in Carnsou's diary as the servant of the Protestant Mr. John Arundel of Trerice, a different branch. Well, the families were the same family back in the 14th century, so the connection is very tenuous. And Twiggs went on to perjure himself. He claimed that a priest had arrived already in 1575 when he came to do the play, but the priest wasn't there then. So, you know, lots of entertainment, a lovely fireplace with mermen to look at, you know, blazing hearth, and as well as the play, there would have been other entertainments, like we saw earlier at Lanherne. Now, if you were a Protestant like William Carnsou, and this is the rebuilt house of Bekelly, or Bekelly in St Neot parish, he went to church on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. He then read Calvin's epistles. Remember I said Edward VI was Calvinist, and that was about as extreme as Protestant got in this country. Not only, and his life, not only on Christmas Day, but also on Boxing Day, and just to make sure, on New Year's Eve as well. And then he gambled at cards most evenings from 28th December, and he tells you if he won and if he lost. And on one occasion, they got so excited, they played cards all through the night. And on 6th of January, he hosted a party with George Grenville from the Kilcampton area, Richard Carew, the historian from Anthony in East Cornwall, and Richard Champanon as well. Those are the people he names. It's a bit like, you know, what's your favourite dinner party? Who would you have there? Well, I'm a bit torn, but let's have a vote. Protestant Christmas or Catholic Christmas? Hands up, please. Catholic Christmas. Protestant Christmas. Yeah, we've got a lot of gamblers here. Okay, I'm split. I would have enjoyed the play, and I would have loved to have met Richard Carew of Anthony. So this is Richard Carew of Anthony, and he was a Protestant, but a bit more broad-minded than Carnsou. I can't see him reading Calvin's life on Christmas, well, 3 times. That's quite excessive. And this is him at age 32 in 1586, but his book wasn't published till 1602. But a lot of what he's writing about is the same period as the Carnsou diary. So he talks about, and here's a weird thing, harvest dinners held between 29th September and the 2nd of February. They're a little bit loose with their terms, aren't they? And near neighbours and kindred invited to dinner. Well, you know, at Bekelly, they weren't near neighbours, they were quite distant. And then Christmas rule consumes a great part of the night after. So again, you get this idea of a rather raucous, rowdy time had by all. But Carew goes on to say that he wouldn't bar sober and open dancing, which I don't think you would have seen at Bekelly, until it were first thoroughly banished from marriages, Christmas revels, and the court. So again, that tells you that, you know, dancing of various types was part of the Christmas revels. Now, the Lords of Misrule come under attack from the Bishop of Exeter in 1579. And again, we've got this muddling of seasons. We've got the question as to whether the minister, the vicar or rector, and the churchwardens have suffered any lords of misrule. Allowed is what suffered means. Summer lords or ladies or any disguised persons or others in Christmas or at May games or any Morris dances or at any other times to come unreverently into church or churchyard and there to dance or play any unseemly parts with scoffs, jests, wanton gestures or ribald talk. See, we're building up a picture from what you're not allowed to do as to what they probably did do. And I've just put in these rather entertaining figures of fun. This guy with his coxcomb hood and his horseshoe-headed staff and possibly Morris bells. And here's another jester from the same church, St Leven, and they may well be Breton carvers' work. And we think they accompanied saints on the rood loft, which has now gone. We've only got the screen base at St Leven. Well, you know, we have a complete break. And it's a break of at least 13 years, although I think also a little earlier in the 1640s, they managed to not have Christmas because it was a fast day. You know, so there is a little bit of a sense of what happened before and what happened after, and how much continuity we get through. But we're not even talking a generation. And in 1660, we get, you know, Merrie Cornwall comes back. Going back just slightly, this is a reference in a Bodmin will. Nicholas Spray or Spry, the former mayor, left 13 shillings and 4p for an annual wassail cup. And again, 13 shillings and 4p is not a negligible sum of money. You probably could have bought a cow. So it's, you know, how much is a cow? We've got farmers here, surely. How much is a cow today? You know, 2,000-3,000? You know, so this is an expensive item. And they tend to be made of lignum vitae, an imported tropical wood, or of, this is a sycamore one, sometimes the apple wood. There are a couple in the museum in Truro. But the idea is to have an annual wassail cup to promote the continuance of love and neighbourly meetings and remember all others to carry more charitable conscience. And on 12th night, they're going to go to the mayor's house and have the cup there. We're going to have a bit more on wassail, but to me, this is charity begins at home. We've got away from religious custom and we're into charitable giving. And at Heligan, and Christine Edwards told me this reference, there are entries in the account books referring to, on the 6th of January, given to a company of wassail men, 1 shillings. And whether it was the same company or another company, on the 6th, a little lower down, given to a company of crossed out and then wassail men, 2 shillings and 6p. We don't know where they came from, but possibly St Neot, they might have been tenants of the Tremaines of Heligan, but Grampound and Truro are also possible. We're also getting early carol books. The earliest that I've seen, which the Record Office doesn't produce, but you can look at a microfiche, dates from 1747 to 1766. And then Henry Nicholas's book is a beautifully illustrated cover from 1805. And these were both given to Davis Gilbert, who was a collector of carols. He was a mathematician, an MP, changed his name to inherit Tresillian from Giddy, and I would say without him and William Sandys a little later, the traditional carol, which is not O Come All Ye Faithful and some of the ones we're more familiar with, the carol ballad singing tradition, usually in a minor key and usually a narrative story, would probably have died out. And this is important for the UK in general. A lead was taken down here to save something of the past. But there's another thing that really bucks up folk customs, and that's losing 11 days from the calendar. I mean, they did it in September, but you go from the 2nd to the 14th. And this means that Old Christmas Day is now the 6th of January. So you have the traditionalists who want to have Christmas on the 6th of January, and the new calendar people who will have it on 25th of December. And there are actually riots in London and elsewhere at this time. Hogarth captures them in the background of one of his election pictures. Now, Christmas is very much known for its St George plays, the Christmas season. And one of the earlier scripts comes from Cornwall, was for a long time known as the Myler play because Ennis, who collected it, lived in Myler Parish at Ennis House. What is great about it is that it doesn't say, it has the names of the performers. And from that, and I don't know if you know the author of the article that we've both used. If you go online, you can find the source for this. But it turns out that all the names are people who were living in Truro in the 1780s, which is how they've dated it, who were all shoemakers. And my excitement is that this may well be a link back to the medieval period. Bodmin and Helston both had shoemakers' guilds. I'm sure the other major towns like Lansdowne and Liscard would also have had trade guilds. But there was a chapel of St George up on Chapel Hill in Truro. And, it may be that we've got some degree of continuity with that. But we've got William Solomon, first part, John Rowe, part the second, Penty Landin, part the third, William King of Egypt, and so on and so forth. And it's a fascinating document. But this is what the plays looked like by the time of Charles Dickens. Robert Seymour did illustrations for Dickens. And by this time, we have a very recognizable old Father Christmas with the longest beard I think I've ever seen. You can see in the background, we've got the dragon, probably St George, a Saracen prince with swords, probably the doctor, all these different characters looking the part. But if Bottrell is to be believed, before this period, the guise dancers and players wore contemporary dress. And he describes cocked hats for men with plumes, ribbons and streamers decorating them, steeple-crowned hats for girls with stiff-bodied gowns, the bag skirts sticking out to the side, or trains and ruffles hanging from their elbows. So again, take your pick. By the early 19th century, wassail songs are being included in some of the books of carols. And I think we distinguish a bit too much between carol singers and wassail singers. The traditional ballad carols and the wassail songs are part of the same tradition. And Richard Polwheel in 1803, and again this is from Merv Davies' little booklet, in some places the parishioners walk in procession, visiting the principal orchards in the parish, single out the principal tree, salute it with a certain form of words, sprinkle it with cider, dash a bowl of cider against it. But the alternative is that the farmer and his workmen can put cakes along the branches, immersed in cider, and sprinkle the tree and dance round it. Or the third alternative, which comes up in the record more often and is what we saw at Helligan, is the practice of visiting houses and offering up a drink, not like the vinegary, briny, horrible drink of the late 14th, early 15th century play reference, the Ordinalia reference, but something called lamb's wool became very popular by the early 19th century, and it was really frothed up with apple. So it's quite a thick drink. So you give, but then you receive, because you don't just give, you expect to get money, you expect to get food, you expect to get proper drink. And that's what they want. You worthy are to be commended, if in this you will not fail. Now our son's song is almost ended, fill our bowl with nappy ale. You know, sorry, it's begging, but it's okay because you've already given something. I've got a couple of slides, 3 or 4 slides, quite a lot of detail. I'll try and pick out the key things. If you want to see the original from which I've summarised, the best person is Margaret Courtney of Penzance. Her brother was an MP who knew Emily Hobhouse, very interesting family. And she recorded in her old age what she had learnt about the early 19th century. So this is pre the Victorian Christmas. So we get going a-gooding on Christmas Eve. So poor women calling on richer neighbours and sometimes getting the ingredients for their Christmas cakes, that type of thing. Every household of a certain size would make currant cakes coloured with saffron, and they would pull up a small portion of the dough. It reminds me of those bargeware teapots with little miniature teapots on top that you see in museums. And that resembled a small cake, and that was called the Christmas. And it was coloured with saffron. And in Falmouth, grocers gave materials for their baking to principal customers. And the houses were dressed up with evergreens, as at Lanherne much earlier, and 2 hoops were fastened, one in the other by nails at the centre, and gaily decorated with evergreens, apples, and oranges. And this is one that I commissioned from Cows and Sows in Idlis, which they very obligingly made for me, and I collected yesterday. But this is another version here. And it looks like we've got one in the Dickens thing. And at night, a lighted candle is stuck on the bottom nail. Well, rather like one of my first memories of a Christmas tree, the little red candles tend to catch things alight, so not necessarily such a great idea. But they also had children, she says in the remote parts, but I think it was once a more common custom, dancing at nightfall around painted lighted candles in a box of sand. And church towers could be illuminated. And also you had the Christmas stock on which a rude figure of man had been chalked, which you would light with a little kindling from the last year's block. That's the Yule log. She also says that choirs from the parish church and dissenting chapels go house to house singing carols for money or eggy hot drink, which sounds quite disgusting, a bit like the eggnog my grandmother loved. It gets better, sweet giblet pie and other pies, mostly meat, which you lace with a jug of clotted cream. I mean, we should try it. It probably is really good. And from Christmas to Twelfth Night, we get parties and mummers known as goose or geese dancers. And that comes from disguising and guise. Parading the streets in an unruly manner with masks. And by the early 19th century, Margaret Courtney rather disapproves of them because they're very rowdy and they scare women and children. And I've put sometimes with a hobby horse, because we'll come back to this. They then entered houses uninvited, played all kinds of antics, and they had to be paid to go away. So you can see why things get classed as begging and get banned and all the rest. And some of them performed St George and the Dragon. Well, shooting parties on St Stephen's Day, the 26th, New Year's Eve. Here's a reference to the wassailing parties, going house to house begging for money to make a feast. Parties on New Year's Eve, and the old women open their Bible to find their luck. And 12th day, general feasting and merriment. And here's a change. Into the cake we'll put a wedding ring, a thimble, and a sixpence. And I've summarized it as marry, never marry, or die rich, according to what you find. Well, where do we get the thimble these days, or the sixpence? But in a Christmas pud on Christmas Day. So things move about. So these are the Christmas or kissing bush, if it has mistletoe in it. That's up for a good long stretch. So are the other decorations. The Christmas stock can also be called a mock or a block. Lump of wood burnt during the Christmas season. We've had the Christmas cake, and you don't eat it until Christmas Day. Ghosts and spirits are less active, and it's a very lucky day to be born on, and you can tell ghost stories without worry at Christmas. This is my favourite. The oxen kneel in the stalls at midnight on 24th of December, but it gets very confused. In England, they thought that the sheep faced east at midnight. But in 1752, we lost the 11 days, and the oxen get very confused. And the old oxen kneel on the 5th of January. You know, it does not make sense, but hey, let's go with it. It's Christmas. And Holy Innocents' Day, it's unlucky to start a voyage. You don't wash your clothes because you'll wash one of the family away. I love it. It's a sort of drop all the housework. Just enjoy yourselves. I mean, what's to mind? And you leave silver on the doorstep so that money is brought into the house on New Year's Day, because you don't lend anything, and you want as little as possible taken out of the house. So forget recycling. You don't do it. You wait till the next day. And another favourite is the floors are swept inwards, so you sweep the dust into the corners, and the doorsteps are sanded, which basically means the visitors step in the sand and make sandy footprints in your house, and that's lucky. So, yeah, Housewife's Charter. And because I think it's quite interesting, how far do we have unusual customs in Cornwall? Or are we really part of Britain? And we are and we aren't. I would say many of the things are similar, but, you know, curl singers or carol singers. Carol singers actually start in Advent in Cornwall. They tend to start more like Christmas Eve, according to what I've read up country. Going a gooding is a little bit earlier up country, and it's called Thomasing because it starts on St Thomas's Day in December. Wassailing, there's a lovely word for it in Sussex, they call it apple howling. It's just great. Goose, geese, dancers, cross-dressing, mummers, geezers, up country, the hobby horse at the Penglas, the Hodden horse in Kent, the Mari Lwyd in Wales, the Christmas play or St George play. Up country you get St George plays, wooing plays, and sword dance plays, amongst other things. Mike and I were discussing droll tellers, which may be an invention of William Bottrell, but storytelling, and especially ghost stories, is going on. Dipping into the Bible on 31st of December. Elsewhere, we get references to fortune-telling. Dancing round the candles and robins alight, which involves fire. Dangerous children's games, yep, that's fine. Obligatory church and chapel attendance, card playing, common. And I love it that at Launceston and Oakhampton, they have the wife market, which in Cornwall is called the Giglet Fair. And there are plenty of other local customs, which we don't have time to go into. So, parallels, but, I would say Cornwall plays a really big role in keeping a lot of this alive. Droll tellers, do they exist? Are they an extinct art? And a lot of the stories recounted in Robert Hunt and William Bottrell, who were working pretty much contemporaneously. I think Bottrell had started earlier, according to Mike. There are Christmas tales. Duffy and the Devil is a sort of Rumpelstiltskin. The devil does the spinning and then comes back to, claim the girl, is a Cornish Christmas story. But what I particularly like, and it explains a lot, is that the people telling the stories took 3 nights over it. 3 nights bed and board, food, drink. Why wouldn't you? So it's a bit like your serial on TV going on for a number of nights. And this is Henry Quick of Zennor, who was reputedly one of the last to go, a poet, but also one of the last to go round telling the tales. But I also think that these stories are very comparable to the carols that are narrative. It's part of the same narrative tradition. Final section, continuity or revival, and it's often hard to tell. Ben Little of Truro, in his day very famous. This is his 1870 Applewood Bowl. He started off at 14, going wassailing, and that meant walking miles all over Cornwall. And there are a couple of very well-known wassail songs of a number, Grandpound and Bonmin, which have very similar verses. But to me, I think wassailing is a continuity rather than a revival. I think, Ben Little is born at a time when a lot of customs are being banned, and so I see wassailing as something that generally did continue, as long as it didn't get too rowdy. And then we get the definite revivals, the St George Christmas play at Hale, performed by St Ives Old Cornwall Society. And in the RIC, the Royal Institution of Cornwall Collections, there are drawings by Robert Morton Nance based on these characters. This is the doctor with his great box of pills, the dragon with his umbrella, St George, I think, the Saracen, old Father Christmas with his bowl and so forth. And here we have the Saracen, St George, Bernard Leach as the doctor with a top hat, Dickon Nance as the dragon, one of the sons of Robert Morton Nance. And this is Keith Hamilton Jenkin, who wrote very evocatively about Cornish traditions and customs published in the 1930s. So, you know, Morton Nance started with these costumes and then adapted them into this. St Ives geezers were still perambulating in the 1890, but were revived in 1975 and continue. And what I think we're missing is the cross-dressing. The fact, and I've heard it from Mousehole people, that the men dress as women and the girls dress as men, and so the men are speaking in falsetto voices, and the women are speaking with very deep voices, and they dress in each other's clothes, and the fun of the evening is trying to avoid recognition, and on the part of people in the house, trying to guess who the people are. We've got to bring it back. It will be such fun. So Cornwall Heritage, cross-dressing, geese evening, please. And this is another interactive one, Spot the Difference. We've got a picture of the Penglas at the Montal Festival in Penzance. And like St Ives, the geese dancers, despite Miss Courtney's distrust of them, and I do wonder if her comments are applying more to the late 19th century than the early 19th century about scaring the children and women. That sort of crawled into the 1930s, and then the Montal Festival has been going since 2007, and I think I went to one of the earliest ones with Penglas. And, you know, sorry, Padstow, you do not have a prerogative of obioses. Helston ought to have one at its Hallentow. It would have originally. They're very, very popular. You know, if you can get an obios in, you get an obios in. They collect more money than anybody else. They're much more entertaining. So as Margaret Courtney noted, in the early 19th century, the hobby horse, represented by a man carrying a piece of wood in the form of a horse's head and neck. So far, so good. With some contrivance for opening and shutting the mouth with a loud snapping noise. The performer being so covered with a horse cloth or hide of a horse. Horse cloth or hide of a horse? Come on, Penzance. Probably a bit smelly, mind you. I think we've got something more like rags and paper, which is a sort of early 19th century thing. But to resemble the animal whose curvettings, bitings, and other motions he imitated. And there we are. And that's it, folks. And I've put in the 9 lessons with carols as an example of the direction in which things go and something peculiarly Cornish that's been adopted all over, and what we hear on Christmas Eve at King's College Chapel. When it started, it was the first service was held in a wooden church, much more like the sort of stable and the manger, which was a replacement while the cathedral was being built. And there's a fascinating article in the Journal of the Royal Institution of Cornwall, this current edition, which I thoroughly recommend you reading. But it's quite an involved story. Benson took the credit, but there was his musical director and others involved. Okay. That's all, folks.
Has got what they now call mummers.
Ah, right, yeah.
Up, and Molly Pinch, who used to run the carols every year, which stop on Christmas Eve. Don't go any further. Stop Christmas Eve.
Yeah,
yeah. The mummers go out on Boxing Day and New Year's Eve.
Yeah, yeah.
They black up and they used to cross-dress.
Right.
Molly used to say, I wore my brother's breeches.
Oh.
And he wore my petticoats and
yeah, yeah.
So that was one way of doing it. And
they
put smuts on their face. And Vic Legg said, if soot was green, there wouldn't be any problem.
Yes, yes.
But because soot's black, there's been an awful lot of kerfuffle.
Yes, yeah.
And also it wasn't helped by the fact that they, in recent years, in the 50s certainly, they used to sing some of the, what you might call darky songs, which were very fashionable at the time.
Yeah, the sort of spirituals.
So therefore you'll end up with a Christmas celebration that is actually controversial.
Politically not correct. Which...
controversial.
Yeah.
With songs that we no longer would definitely sing, and they don't. But they've been tarred with the fact that they've been blacking out.
Yeah, yeah.
And there's been a lot of controversy.
Yeah.
And living just outside Pastor, we don't go in.
Yes.
On the grounds, we don't want to be open to controversy.
Yeah. Julie, yeah.
What's your take on the correct Christmas Day?
Well, funnily enough, we had a friend who was teaching in Gran Canaria, and Alex and I went out, and we were flying out on the 6th of January, and we met her at the airport because she had to come back to look after her mother. And 6th of January, all the kids were out with their super duper brand new toy cars racing up and down. And when we left a week later, the Christmas decorations were still up. So I think Christmas should go on. I think we should embrace both, the old and the new. Have the lot. Why not? It's miserable enough, you know. So my answer is both. Yeah. And the solstice, yes. Yeah, on the 21st. So I think, you know, the more you can celebrate at this time of year, the better. And, you know, if we can take it to the 2nd of February, Old Candlemas Day, you know, so much the better.
We keep the crib up until
the 2nd of
January.
Yeah.
2nd of February.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. And if everyone can join me in giving Jo another hand for an excellent talk this afternoon.